Gordy built a $200 million empire. David Ruffin built the sound that sold every single dollar of it. My girl ain't too proud to beg. I wish it would rain. Every record that made Motown a household name across America and Britain, Ruffin's voice was the engine behind it. And when Gordy decided he was done with him, there was no negotiation, no farewell, no financial conversation. They replaced him before the week was over and handed him a bus ticket home like he was a session musician who'd overstayed his welcome. But here's what the documentaries always skip. This isn't really a story about drugs. It isn't about ego. It's about what happened in 1968 when a black artist dared to ask a powerful label owner one simple question: where is my money? Out of 100% of viewers, only 2% actually subscribe after watching, which is honestly really disappointing. If you want to support the channel, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. It truly means a lot. Before we talk about the betrayal, you have to understand who David Ruffin actually was. Because you can't feel the weight of what was done to him unless you first feel the weight of what he built. Davis Eli Ruffin was born on January 18, 1941, in a place called Wynot, Mississippi. That's the actual name of the town, Wynot. And honestly, it feels like the universe was writing the title of his life story from the very beginning. His mother died during childbirth. His father was a Baptist minister, a hard, serious man who raised his children in the church. David grew up singing gospel, not performing it, living it. That's where the rawness in his voice came from. That ache that you can't manufacture. That thing that made Marvin Gaye stop one day and say, publicly, that he heard a strength in David Ruffin's voice that his own voice lacked. Think about that for a second. Marvin Gaye, one of the most gifted human beings who ever stood in front of a microphone. And he said that. By 13 years old, David had already left home. 13. To pursue the ministry of all things. But somewhere between Mississippi and Memphis, the music pulled him sideways, and he started performing in talent shows. He had that thing you can't teach. That quality that makes a room stop. He eventually made his way to Detroit. And here's a detail that almost nobody knows. Before David Ruffin ever sang a single note on a Motown record, before any of it, he helped build the building. Literally. He lived with Gordy's father, worked alongside him doing construction, and helped physically construct the space that would become Hitsville, USA. The recording studio. The nerve center of the entire empire. He built the house. And then he was thrown out of it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. By 1964, Ruffin had joined the Temptations, replacing a founding member named Elbridge Bryant, who'd been fired after a fight. When David stepped in, the group hadn't had a single major hit. They were talented. They were hungry. But they hadn't broken through yet. Then Smokey Robinson wrote a song. He didn't write it for just any voice. He wrote it specifically for David Ruffin. Robinson later said his goal was to find the perfect song for that particular voice, something Ruffin could belt out, but that was also melodic and tender at the same time. The result was My Girl. Released in late 1964, it went to number 1 in early 1965. The Temptations' first ever number 1 single. And what followed was a run that almost defies belief. Ain't Too Proud to Beg, Beauty Is Only Skin Deep, I Wish It Would Rain, Since I Lost My Baby, hit after hit, all riding on that voice. That raw, raspy, heartbreaking tenor. And here's something that gets overlooked entirely. Ruffin didn't just sing. He innovated. He's actually credited with creating the four-headed microphone stand, the setup that allowed the Temptations to sing and choreograph simultaneously without crowding a single mic. You've seen that iconic image of 5 men moving in perfect sync. That was his idea. He made that possible. By the mid-1960s, the Temptations were appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show, American Bandstand, touring internationally. They were the biggest black male group in the world. And the face of all of it, the voice the world was falling in love with, was David Ruffin. So keep that image in your head. The boy from Wynot, Mississippi. No mother. A preacher for father. Left home at 13. Helped build Hitsville with his own hands. And then sang his way into becoming one of the most recognizable voices in American music history. Hold that image. Because what comes next is going to hit different. Here's the thing about success. Sometimes it reveals who you are. And sometimes it reveals who the people around you are. By 1966, something was shifting in David Ruffin's world. The hits kept coming. The crowds kept growing. But inside the machine, the gears were grinding. The attention wasn't equal. When you're the face of a group, the voice people are buying tickets to hear, the world starts treating you differently. And David Ruffin started noticing it. Journalists were interviewing him specifically. Fans were calling his name louder. The spotlight had a favorite. Now, and this is important, some of what happened next was David's own doing. Let's be honest about that. He developed a serious cocaine habit. He started showing up late to rehearsals, missing group meetings. His behavior became erratic in ways that genuinely disrupted the group. He also wanted the group renamed to David Ruffin and the Temptations, the same billing that Diana Ross had with the Supremes, that Smokey Robinson had with the Miracles. That wasn't a crazy request for the era. It was actually standard practice for groups with a dominant frontman. But the other Temptations rejected it, and the tension became impossible to contain. But here's what the drug narrative conveniently buries. Right around this same time, as the cocaine and the ego stories were being written, David Ruffin started asking questions about money. Not demanding more, not renegotiating, just asking to see the numbers. Asking for a basic accounting of what the group was earning and where it was going. And that, more than the drugs, more than the name change request, more than any missed rehearsal, is what created real friction with Gordy. Motown's business model was extraordinary. From the outside, it looked like a family. Artists were groomed, styled, trained in etiquette, taught how to walk into a room. But underneath the polish, the structure was a machine, and the artists were the parts. Motown managed its artists through a subsidiary called International Talent Management Incorporated, which sounds independent, except it wasn't. It was a Motown company. So the people managing your career and the people cutting your checks were the same organization. You didn't negotiate with Motown. You negotiated with Motown about what Motown was already doing. When Ruffin pushed back and demanded financial transparency, Motown partially gave in. They allowed the Temptations to hire an outside accounting firm. But, and you need to read this carefully, that outside firm was never given full access to the books. International Talent Management controlled what the accountants could see. Let that sit. You get your own accountant, but your accountant isn't allowed to see everything. That's not transparency. That's theater. And David Ruffin knew it. So now you have a situation where the label's most important frontman is asking where his money went. The label is stonewalling him with controlled access. He's self-medicating with cocaine. The group is fracturing, and everyone is waiting for him to do something they can point to. In June 1968, he gave them what they were waiting for. The Temptations had a show booked in Cleveland, a supper club engagement. David Ruffin didn't show up. Instead, he went to watch his girlfriend perform. Her name was Barbara Gail Martin, Dean Martin's daughter. He chose her show over his groups. And that was it. 5 days later, on June 27, 1968, David Ruffin was fired from the Temptations. But here's the detail I need you to hold on to, because we're coming back to it. He was replaced before the week was out. No negotiation. No meeting where they tried to fix things. No discussion about what he was owed. And there's a reason for that speed. A reason that has nothing to do with a missed show in Cleveland. It's July 1968. The Temptations are on tour. Sold-out venues. Dennis Edwards, a talented singer, genuinely, has taken David's spot. The show must go on, as they say. And then, at a concert during that first week of the tour, something extraordinary happens. David Ruffin appears. Not announced. Not invited. He slips past security, walks through the venue, makes his way to the stage, and mid-song, he steps into the spotlight, takes the microphone right out of Dennis Edwards' hands, and sings. The crowd goes absolutely insane. Then he disappears. And he does it again. And again. Multiple times across multiple July shows. The Temptations hire more security. Ruffin finds a different way in. The crowd keeps erupting every time they see those glasses, that frame, that unmistakable silhouette walking toward the microphone that used to be his. Think about what you're actually watching when you picture that scene. This is a man who was the face of one of the most successful groups in American music history. His voice was the product. His name was what people came to see. and his sneaking past security guards just to stand on a stage that he built for 30 seconds to remind the crowd, and maybe himself, that he still existed. That's not ego. That's a man who's been erased trying to prove he's still real. At one point, according to Dennis Edwards himself, the audience reaction was so powerful that the other Temptations briefly considered giving Ruffin another chance. Edwards said the crowd's love for Ruffin actually moved him. He reportedly encouraged the group to take David back. They gave him a shot. A return engagement was arranged in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Ruffin showed up late. And that was the end. Permanently. But the humiliation didn't stop there. Because Ruffin still had a contract with Motown as a solo artist. He always had. Here's another detail that rewrites the whole story if you pay attention to it. David Ruffin never had the same contract as the other Temptations. From the beginning, he had a separate solo deal, which means the other 4 members of the group were contractual bound to each other in ways that David was not, and in ways that David could not be. Multiple people who were close to the situation have said that separate contract was a source of deep tension inside the group for years. It created a hierarchy that was written into the paperwork before the first show was ever performed. You have to ask yourself, who benefits from a frontman having a separate contract? Not the frontman. After the firing, Ruffin tried to sue his way out of Motown entirely. In October 1968, he filed suit against Motown Records, seeking 2 things: a release from his contract and a full accounting of his money. Motown countersued. The case eventually settled, and the settlement required Ruffin to stay with Motown and finish out his solo contract on their terms. He asked for his freedom and his money. He got neither. His first solo single, My Whole World Ended the Moment You Left Me, reached the top 10 in 1969. There was genuine promise there. But Motown gave him the bare minimum of support once it became clear he wasn't pulling Temptations-level numbers alone. Then, in 1971, Ruffin went into the studio and recorded an entire album. A full, complete, finished record. Motown shelved it. No explanation given to the public. No release date announced. They just locked it in a vault. That album didn't come out until 2004, 33 years later, long after David Ruffin was dead. Let me ask you something directly. If you created something you poured yourself into, and the people who owned your contract just buried it without explanation, what would that do to you? Not just to your career, to your sense of self, to your belief that your work had value. Because that's what happened. Systematically, repeatedly. And the man was already using cocaine to manage whatever was happening inside him. This wasn't help. This was accelerant. But here's the question the story keeps avoiding. Who is actually responsible for what happens next? I want to stop here and show you something. Because the best way to understand what was done to David Ruffin isn't to just describe it in isolation. It's to compare it to what was happening 20 feet away, on the same label, at the exact same time. The Four Tops. Same era. Same Motown. Same Berry Gordy. Levi Stubbs, Abdul Duke Farka, Renaldo Obi Benson, and Lawrence Payton. They were delivering hits that were competing directly with the Temptations for chart dominance. I Can't Help Myself. Reach Out, I'll Be There. Barnadette. World-class records. World-class performances. And here is the single most important fact about the Four Tops that almost no one ever highlights in the context of this story. Those 4 men performed together without a single personnel change for over 4 decades. Until 1997. Not one swap. Not one replacement mid-tour. Not one member handed a bus ticket. Now, the Four Tops eventually left Motown too. When Gordy moved the company to Los Angeles in 1972, he effectively abandoned most of his older Detroit acts. The Four Tops, along with others, were left behind and departed for ABC Dunhill, so they weren't immune to Motown's coldness. But they left together, with their dignity, with their lineup intact. As a unit, David Ruffin was cut out alone. And that distinction matters enormously, because it tells you something about how Motown valued different kinds of artists. The Four Tops had no dominant frontman pushing for separate billing. They functioned as a group, credited as a group, contractual structured as a group. Levi Stubbs was a lead voice, extraordinary, one of the greatest baritones in soul music history, but he never pushed for Levi Stubbs and the Four Tops. The moment David Ruffin started behaving like a frontman, started asking for frontman billing, started asking for frontman accounting. The system moved to eliminate him. The lesson Motown seemed to be teaching, whether intentionally or not, was this: you can be a star. You just can't know that you're a star. You can generate the money. You just can't ask where it went. You can be the face. You just can't act like one. And this is where the story shifts from being about David Ruffin specifically and starts being about something much larger. Because Ruffin wasn't the only one. Holland Dozier Holland, the songwriting and production team behind some of the biggest Motown records ever made, left the label in 1967, a full year before Ruffin's firing, over royalty payment disputes. They felt they weren't receiving what they were owed. Sound familiar? Marvin Gaye fought Gordy for years over creative control. When he recorded What's Going On, one of the most important albums in American music history, Gordy initially refused to release it, called it uncommercial. Gaye had to fight just to get his own art heard. This is the pattern. It wasn't unique to Ruffin. It was the operating system. But Ruffin was arguably the most visible casualty of it. Because he was replaced so publicly, so quickly, and with so little dignity. And unlike Marvin Gaye, who had the strength and the direct personal connection to Gordy to keep fighting, David Ruffin was now alone. On Motown's terms. With a buried album, a counter-lawsuit on his record, and a cocaine habit that was accelerating towards something nobody wanted to look at directly. The question was never really, why did David Ruffin fall apart? The question is, who created the conditions for the fall? Here's what the official version of this story wants you to believe. David Ruffin was a genius. Tragically flawed. The drugs got him. His ego got him. He missed too many shows, pushed too hard, asked for too much. And Motown, reluctantly, had no choice. That's the version. And parts of it are technically true. He did miss shows. He did develop a serious cocaine addiction. His behavior was genuinely difficult at times. Nobody reasonable is going to argue otherwise. But technically true and the whole truth are very different things. Let's walk through the timeline again. This time slowly. 1964, Ruffin joins the Temptations. He signs a separate solo contract, different from the group contract, which nobody makes a fuss about publicly. 1965 to 1968, he leads the group through the most commercially successful period in their history. #1 singles, international tours, television appearances. He is the product. He is what people are paying for. Mid to late 1960s, he begins asking for a financial accounting. Not for more money, to see the numbers. Basic transparency that any salaried employee in any industry would consider a normal right. This creates, according to multiple documented accounts, direct friction with Berry Gordy himself. Motown's response: they allow an outside accountant, but give that accountant deliberately restricted access to the books. Then, conveniently, the ego stories get louder. The drug stories get louder. The missed show happens. And the firing comes within the week. Now ask yourself, what would you do if you were running a label, and your most valuable artist started asking questions you didn't want to answer? Would you answer them? Or would you wait for him to give you a reason to make the conversation go away permanently? I'm not saying Gordy engineered Ruffin's self-destruction. I want to be precise here, because this channel deals in facts, not speculation. What I am saying is that the firing solved a problem that had nothing to do with Cleveland. And the response after the firing tells you everything. When Ruffin sued for his freedom and his money, Motown didn't say, "You're right, let's settle this fairly." They countersued. They trapped him inside his contract. They gave him just enough solo support to technically fulfill their obligation, then withdrew. They recorded his album and shelved it for 33 years. That's not a label mourning the loss of a great artist. That's a label making sure a problem stays managed. Now here's the thing about Berry Gordy that makes this genuinely complicated, and I want to be fair to the complexity of the man. Gordy was not a cartoonish villain. He was a visionary. He built something that had never existed before, a black-owned entertainment empire that put African-American artists into mainstream American living rooms at a time when that was genuinely revolutionary. The Motown story is a story of black excellence and innovation and courage. That's real. But great institutions can do great things and still grind up the individuals inside them. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Gordy ran Motown the way Henry Ford ran an assembly line. The product was the priority. The parts were interchangeable. And when a part started asking questions about the factory's profit margins, it was replaced. David Ruffin wasn't just a casualty of the music industry. He was a casualty of a specific kind of power structure, one that took everything he had to offer, kept him just informed enough to stay compliant, and then discarded him the moment the calculus shifted. And the saddest part? He knew it. That's why he kept sneaking back onto the stage. Not because he was delusional, but because on that stage, for 30 seconds, the truth was visible. The crowd's reaction told the truth that the contracts and the counter-lawsuits and the shelved albums were trying to bury. He was irreplaceable. And they replaced him anyway. Hold on to that. Because we're almost at the end of this story, and the ending is worse than you think. By the early 1970s, David Ruffin was essentially a ghost inside the machine he'd built. His solo career produced flashes of brilliance. Walk Away from Love in 1975 reached the top 10 and earned him a gold record. Those moments proved the voice was still there. The talent hadn't gone anywhere, but the infrastructure around him had crumbled. Motown gave him minimal support. The industry had moved on to newer acts. And the cocaine, which he'd been using since the late 1960s, had become the organizing principle of his life. In 1979, he was arrested for tax evasion. A man who had generated millions for a record label couldn't keep his own taxes in order. Make of that what you will. 1982 brought a brief resurrection. He and Eddie Kendricks, his old friend and fellow Temptations lead voice, rejoined the group for a reunion tour. The audiences loved it. For a moment, it looked like the story might have a redemptive chapter. Then Ruffin started missing shows. The group was fined thousands of dollars because of his absences. By Christmas 1982, Otis Williams fired him from the Temptations for the second and final time. But the story wasn't over. Not quite. In the mid-1980s, Hall and Oates, two of the biggest pop artists in the world at that point, brought Ruffin and Kendricks out to perform with them at a legendary show at the Apollo Theater. And then, in 1985, David Ruffin stood on the stage at Live Aid in Philadelphia, in front of a global audience. And he reminded everybody exactly what had been there all along. Then 1989 arrived. David Ruffin was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Along with the other members of the Temptations classic lineup, his name was officially enshrined as one of the defining figures in American music. He had made it to the mountaintop. Finally. Legitimately. After everything. 2 years later, on June 1, 1991, David Ruffin collapsed inside a crack house in West Philadelphia. Someone drove him to the hospital. According to accounts from those close to the situation, they didn't carry him in. They left him outside. He was 50 years old. His family later claimed that a money belt containing approximately $300,000, the proceeds from a recent tour, was missing from his body when he died. The Ruffin family pursued the matter legally, but ultimately lost the case. The cause of death was ruled an accidental cocaine overdose. Michael Jackson paid for the funeral. And here's the moment I want you to sit with. Really sit with. The man who taught himself to sing in a Mississippi gospel church. Who left home at 13 with nothing. Who helped build the physical walls of Hitsville, USA, with his own hands. Who sang the opening note of the song that became the signature record of a $200 million label. Who invented the microphone stand that gave us one of the most iconic images in pop music history. That man died alone, outside a hospital, with his money missing. And the label he built? Still generating royalties. Still licensing My Girl to commercials and films and television shows. Still earning. Still collecting. David Ruffin never got to see a cent of it. So what do we do with that? I think we start by telling the truth about what happened, which is what this video exists to do. Not to tear down a legacy. Not to rewrite history. But to make sure that when we celebrate the Motown sound, we remember exactly who paid for it. We remember a kid from Why Not, Mississippi who gave everything he had to a machine that wasn't designed to give anything back. We remember that asking where is my money shouldn't be a career-ending question. And we remember that sometimes the most powerful voices in the room are also the most vulnerable. Because power knows exactly how to use a voice while making the person behind it feel like they have none. David Ruffin deserved better. He deserved the truth. And now, At least, you have it.